Welcome. I'm Jackie Cohen-Roth, founder of CannabizMD and sister social enterprise TPAD. It's such a thrill to have you here today in person in Baltimore as well as on Zoom for the third annual CannabizMD Cannabis Science and Policy Forum. Pardon me. And so it's an exciting time for CannabizMD as we flourish along with the medical cannabis industry, actually across the planet. CannabizMD will be 4 years old October 2nd. I think that's just right around the corner. Thank you. So, thanks. Yeah. So as somebody, people often ask, do I sleep? Yes, I do. But I have been blessed with, usually your word, blessed with a great deal of energy that my focus is always to use it for greater good than evil. So that's where CannabizMD comes in. Most of us who are most passionate in the industry do have personal stories. I'm a medical cannabis patient myself. I say I've been in the industry for decades. I unfortunately lost my mother, my sister, and my father to cancer. And I frequently think about what cannabis would have done for them in their last weeks and days. However, that same sister, my big sister, 8 years older than I, gave me the lecture, as both of my sisters did, on the evils of cannabis. And but here I am. As I said to one sister, we had the same mom, and when somebody says don't, what do? You do. So again, thank you. And let's see. CannabizMD was launched in 2017 with the mission to educate, build, and engage an ecosystem of patients, the industry owners, operators, ancillary service providers, the healthcare providers, as well as the policy influencers. The focus is on, as I say, everything that I do. Prior to cannabis industry, I was in conventional healthcare, and it all focuses on driving optimal patient care. So very pleased to have everybody here. There's a Hebrew concept, tikkun olam, which literally means repair of the world. And that's the foundation that I try to live my life by. Both CannabizMD are founded upon in TPAD, and that what it means is, again, literally repair of the world. We're here together in Baltimore and on Zoom collectively for the same reason, to repair the world by education on cannabinoid therapies, cannabis science, cannabis research, innovation, and all of it, again, driving optimal patient care. Behind it all are the effective policies and industry best standards. The medical cannabis industry is certainly an exciting one to work in. It's a rocket ship, and it's one that is just entirely complex, and we are going to be joined today with a number of industry experts, national industry experts, that we're going to be focused on leading clinical care, research, regulatory issues, as well as the future of this intriguing industry. And now I have some housekeeping notes and as well as some thank yous. I'm going to start off with the thank yous first. I'd like to introduce you to some really fantastic ladies that are in the currently in the medical cannabis program at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. I went through that. I refer to myself as a member of the first class, the guinea pig class, but it was an outstanding program, and I'm really delighted to now be a faculty member there, adjunct faculty with a focus on cannabis laws and policies. So Dr. Michelle Jourdain has joined us from Florida. Yeah, McKenna Campbell has come in from Massachusetts. And then our extraordinaire intern for both CannabizMD and TPAD, Emily Jacobs. So there it happened to be in town in Washington actually yesterday for a seminar. So throughout the program, there's a requirement that everybody comes in, no matter where you are in the globe. You have to be in DC twice a year for one of the seminars. Secondly is Carl Coble. Thanks. Carl's a dedicated member of the TPAD Advisory Board. His company, Goodwin Recruiting, has been very supportive of CannabizMD and TPAD along the way. He's been an integral part of planning and executing the forum and then TPAD tonight, which I hope that folks will stay at 6 o'clock. Next up is my business partner, Steve Landit. Steve answered a post of mine just about a year ago on Facebook group for the University of Maryland program. He understood my vision, saw my vision for both CannabizMD and TPAD, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have his understanding of where and how to grow both companies, and I'm grateful also to have his energy and enthusiasm and supporting mine, and he's an innovator in his own right. So thank you, Steve. And now to our forum sponsors. Whoops. Back it up, Jackie. There we go. So we have True Leaf. Lauren Niehaus will be joining us on the regulatory panel. Grateful to have True Leaf support as the gold sponsor. Canasutica is here, and thank you for your support as a silver sponsor. And then High Grade Labs, one of, if not the newest lab that's going to be opening here in Maryland. And thank you for our sponsors for helping to deliver and execute our mission. Okay. So housekeeping, and also I just wanted to also thank, of course, our experts that are joining us, and everybody's here, which is very exciting. The first two, year one and year two, we were hybrid, or I'm sorry, virtual. All of us were hunkered down, so it's really tremendous to be here together, and as well as to have those folks that are joining us on Zoom. So in the program book, Wi-Fi, actually I wanted to mention the Wi-Fi code is 801, is it West? Yeah, West Baltimore. And the B is capitalized. So everything is lowercase, 801 West Baltimore with a capital B. The forum is being recorded, so for those folks on Zoom, we're letting you know. And then for everybody, we'll be receiving a recording in the next couple of weeks once we go through some editing. For those of you joining us on Zoom, please network, ask questions through the chat. We're going to be moderating what you have to, not moderating, but watching and engaging with you throughout the day. So folks on Zoom are going to have the opportunity to be involved today with a Q&A session that follows the keynote that you're going to hear in just a bit, as well as each panel discussion. We're going to break at 12:30 or thereabouts for 30 minutes for lunch. And again, Zoom folks encourage you to take that time for your own break, and then again, networking with each other in the chat. So the medical cannabis industry is, as far as I know, the most complex industry that we have on the planet. It's actually 3 in 1, with cultivation being the agriculture industry, processing being the manufacturing industry, and then dispensaries being the retail portion. And the mix of this are complex regulations which require the strictest of compliance measures. Via the forum, we're going to walk through the industry, so to speak. The first is science and clinical applications for roundtable 1. Those folks are going to join us in just a bit. Next is a regulatory framework that's now in place, and as well as how that's evolving. And then lastly, we end the day with innovation and emerging trends, particularly in the U.S. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jordan Tishler. Yeah. Well, why don't I? So we'll keep our 6 feet apart. Is please introduce yourself. So Dr. Tishler is joining us from Boston, and he is a cannabis specialist, and some more, much more things to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Jackie and colleagues, for putting on this wonderful event. You all can hear me, right? No, not so much? All right. I'm never very comfortable confined behind a podium. I like to walk around and wave my arms ridiculously, but we'll see how it goes. If I come off mic and you just start putting your ears up. So let's see about this here ghost in the machine. And also thank you guys for bearing with me, because it really is doing things on its own. This is the first in-person talk I've given since the pandemic began, and so it's the first time I've had to think about the length of my tie relative to my torso. I hope I got it right. So just a 2 cents about myself. I often say I come from as conventional a background as possible. I went to Harvard College, Harvard Medical School, and trained at a Harvard hospital. We always say if you make it through Harvard 3 times over, we call you Preparation H. There we go. After my training, I went and worked in East Boston for a while, which is an underserved population, and then moved over to working as an emergency room doc at the VA, where I was for about 15 years. And it was really through that time period, as my home state of Massachusetts started to talk about medical cannabis. I don't think I had any idea what they were talking about. I sort of thought, you know, it's interesting that I spend so much of my professional time taking care of folks who have been really harmed by substances. And on that top 10 list, alcohol is 1 through 9, right? And we would see patients multiple times a week in the ED. And yet, I had never seen anybody in the ED sick with cannabis. Now, we've seen some of that come along subsequently, but it led me to that kind of aha moment where I said, well, look, if cannabis is so much or so much less dangerous than some of these freely available substances, and it might have some medical value, I should learn something about this, shouldn't I? Well, back then, which is over 10 years ago now, it was very fashionable to say, yeah, but there's no evidence, there's no data, right? And the irony of this to me, of course, was that if you went to PubMed, which is the Google for science, and you put the word cannabis in, at that time you only got a measly 25,000 studies. This presents actually much the opposite problem, like, all right, I've got 25,000 studies, how do I figure out what they mean? And that led me to several years of trying to figure that out, and I came away from it with an understanding that cannabis really could be used as a medicine. But like all medicines, there are risks and best practices associated with it, not just pure benefit, and that we needed to treat this like a medicine, and this is really the genesis of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I went and formed my private practice, InhaleMD, because frankly, the VA didn't want me to practice this kind of medicine. In fact, they sort of bumped that all the way up to the Washington head of their legal department, who said, well, whatever he's doing on his own time, which was great. And then I sort of said, you know, I was actually hanging out with a friend whose name is Sue Sisley. You guys will probably mostly know who she is. And she was making fun of me and calling me a unicorn because she said, oh, Jordan, you're just the only doctor in the world who actually wants to take care of your patients. Just write recommendations like everybody else. I got kind of upset with that. I was like, I don't know about that. I'm in this to take care of people, right? So that led me to form the Association of Cannabinoid. This slide is old. I changed the logo, but I didn't change the text. The Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. And the mission of this organization initially was to just kind of gather in providers who had that kind of an idea. And subsequently, we've developed a mission around education and around advocacy, and that's sort of the focus. I just want to mention the last thing on the slide, which is thankfully staying put for us, is that I am now an advisor to a company called Troche that makes actually a cannabinoid delivery vehicle. It's an oral buccal delivery, which has nothing whatsoever to do with anything I'm going to talk to you about, but that's my conflict of interest statement. This slide is here not to give us a whole lot of information, but just to point out the obvious thing that most of the country now has access to cannabinoids of one form or another, and that adult use, or I tend to use the expression recreational cannabis, is sweeping across the country for better or for worse. And certainly our experience on the West Coast has demonstrated the ways in which recreational legalization, while being a good thing in many ways, has been harmful to patient care. And in Massachusetts, I've certainly seen that play out, even though Massachusetts has done a fairly good job relative to other states of thinking about some of these things ahead of time. I'm going to stop for just a second. So this is a collection of real quotations, And I bring them up just to illustrate sort of some of the stuff that as a practitioner we're up against. This was really said to me. The bud tender said, "I don't know what your doctor's talking about. Don't listen to him. I'll tell you what to do." Okay. They kept trying to get me to buy more. They have these volume deals and push other products. And what's up with the prize wheel? This isn't The Price is Right. I actually toured a dispensary at one point, and they like wanted me to spin the prize wheel. I was like, oh, okay, guys. He told me to add this keef stuff to my vaporizer, and now I feel sick. Why? And this is another example of, things going awry for no particularly good reason. And you were right, doctor. They immediately suggested CBD. It's a good thing you warned me about how dangerous this could be for me. This was about a patient. This is actually, I think, kind of interesting. I had 2 patients show up within a month of each other, and both of them had liver transplants, right? So they were on a class of drugs, tacrolimus, everolimus, extraordinarily dangerous, highly potent immunosuppressives that are absolutely necessary when you have transplants so that you don't reject the transplanted organ. But they're below the appropriate level, you lose the organ, and above it, it's lethal. So you really need to be in a very narrow window, and it turns out that CBD interacts with these things. They came to me for routine back pain, which had nothing whatsoever to do with their transplants, but I could just see the problem coming, that they go into the dispensary and somebody says, "What's going on?" And they say, "I have back pain," right? Without that context, that broader context that we as clinicians get. And I could just, I was grateful to have seen that coming because it played out. The current dispensing system is good for the industry. And I should say right up front that I am not anti-industry at all. Heck, I'm an advisor to a company, right, and several before that. But I do think that we have to kind of view these things in priority. And for me, at least, I would always put the priority on patients' well-being before anything else. So I'll own that bias. But really, at this point, the dispensing system is set up for people to sell a lot of product. We see misdirection, we see upselling tactics like this prize wheel we talked about, we see false or unsubstantiated claims. Certainly we saw a number of these things get letters from the FDA or from the Federal Trade Commission during COVID, particularly regarding CBD and treatment of COVID. And then there's a whole lot of sort of inadequate medical knowledge at the dispensary, and I just want to clarify that by saying I think that our friends, the bud tenders, are really in a very untenable position. They're being set out on the front line saying, sell this stuff, number one, and number two, give people medical advice that, unless you go to medical school or nursing school or something, you're really ill-equipped to give that kind of advice. And then, of course, there's a conflict of interest, right? You're giving medical advice, but you're also selling that product, right? And, generally we try to avoid that. The key takeaway here, from my perspective, is that patients are not the same as recreational users. And again, let me emphasize that these are two, legitimate uses, legitimate groups, and I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on recreational users in the least, but that we need to understand that the goals are different and often very much opposite each other. Recreational users are looking for an experience. I said they love the ride, and because of the picture of the roller coaster. But this leads to different wants, right? There's what's new, what's exciting, what can I try that I haven't tried before? And that kind of experimentation process is part of the process, is part of the fun. And again, on a recreational level, that's awesome. Maybe slightly less awesome is this general trend towards more is better, right? I mean, if you use more, you're going to get higher, and up to a point that's good and probably not so good past that point. Where I worry about that much more is in the development of tolerance and the risk of use disorders and stuff like that. Patients, on the opposite, are not looking for an experience. They're looking to feel normal. They want to get back to themselves. Whatever their illness is robbing them of what it is they want out of life, and they just want to get back on track, right? The high, or I usually say intoxication, is a side effect. Generally speaking, my patients will come in and say, "Doc, give me the kind of cannabis that doesn't cause any intoxication." And I have to say, well, you know, if we're looking for something that's going to work for you, largely you're going to have some intoxication, but this leads us to this concept of the minimal effective dose. How little, not how much can we take, but how little do we need to use in order to get the benefit we're looking for without going over that? And really what we know, and I don't think that slide's in this deck, is that, you know, like most things, there's a bell-shaped distribution, right? And somewhere sort of at the top of that distribution, we get the best benefit with the least side effect. And by going at a higher dose than that, you don't get better benefit, you just get more side effects. And this isn't unique to cannabis, this is just pharmacology, right? And then, of course, the complicated for the industry and for us is that most of these folks are really sick. You know, like the example I gave, you know, the patient may have back pain, but it's back pain in this much broader, I hate to use this word, holistic context of, you know, the liver transplant or their cardiac disease or whatever else is going on, and we have to put all of those puzzle pieces together before we make knee-jerk reactions. Right now, I think that there are strong historical parallels with where we are in this industry with an era in medicine called the patent medicine era. And this existed really from the end of the Civil War up until the 1934 when the FDA came along. And you know, we all have seen the posters and the boxes and maybe little cute bottles, and it's, you know, Dr. John's elixir, right? And it says kind of good for what ails you, and it makes your hair regrow, and it cures your liver disease, and, you know, makes you have pretty toenails or something. I don't know, you know. But the point was that there were all kinds of wacky claims going around that were made up by the seller or the manufacturer, and you really couldn't trust the medicine that you were getting. There was no quality control. There was a lot of variability from bottle to bottle, batch to batch, and worse, that there was a whole lot of contamination. I mean, that's not even talking about the fact that they thought that putting arsenic in things was a good idea at the time, but then there was arsenic in this stuff. And then there was no attempt really to prove efficacy, right? I mean, this is one of the things that I'm continually discussing with colleagues, is that getting to the point where a medicine supply, cannabis included, is safe is a hugely important step, but it is the lowest bar, right? So yes, we want safe medicine, but we'd also like to know that the medicine works, right? And it works for what and at what doses, et cetera. And so I think that, you know, in this era, that was not even a discussion. Now we need to be having that discussion. So in 1934, I'd like to believe the federal government got fed up with this patent medicine stuff. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you. And anyway, they established the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1934, which is the basis of the existence of the FDA, and frankly, the basis by which the FDA works still to this day. And that established the safety regulations, standardized dosing measurements. It defines a prescription, which we're going to talk about more. Prescription having some key elements to it, like the specific medication, the dose, the frequency, how you take it, what's the route of administration, oral versus other things, and an amount to be dispensed. Thus establishing some sales limits, which, you know, has some effect on reining in that conflict of interest that we talked about. And that's my last point. So where are the FDA now? Frankly, I think the FDA is doing the best it can, which is not to say super great, but they have their hands tied in many ways. The fact is that cannabis remains on Schedule 1, which means no, you can't have it, end of discussion. There's no question that it does not meet the standard for Schedule 1, never did. We know that cannabis, as well as several other of the hallucinogens, are in Schedule 1 for purely political reasons, having nothing whatsoever to do with medicine or science. But it is in Schedule 1, and that means that there's a limit to what the FDA can do, right? I mean, they can't go out and regulate a substance that the rest of the government says is not for discussion, right? Furthermore, the FDA can really only regulate on the basis of data, right? We have to say, here are some tox studies, here are some human trials, et cetera. So the fact that we can't readily do those studies because of Schedule 1 means that we can't go to the FDA and say, make regulations like this based on these data, right? Now, we're working on that a little bit, so we'll see. Botanicals pose some interesting challenges for regulation. As you all know, there's lots of debate on how many cannabinoids there actually are, but it's well over 100, and then we can start to talk about all the terpenoids, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at cannabis, it's very hard to say, this is the drug we're using in our studies, right? So it's hard to go to the FDA and say, this is what's in our mixture, and we've studied it, and now you can approve it for general sale. There are some precedents, historical precedents for how to deal with botanicals, but they're dusty, and frankly, I don't think people who work presently at the FDA have seen these things in service before. So there's a bit of a dusting off and coming to the realization that they're gonna hopefully need to do something with them. There is, at the moment, very much a desire being put forward to the FDA to look at cannabis as a supplement, which has very loose regulation around it, rather than as a pharmaceutical, which has the ultimate regulation around it. And there really isn't a lot of discussion about sort of establishing a middle lane that is neither as loosey-goosey as the supplements, nor necessarily as tight as the pharmaceuticals. And I think in part we're going to see, I hope, that lane established, but I think it's also going to be temporary until we get those pharmaceuticals that we can then be, more reliant upon. Before I dive into this, I'm fairly disappointed with the current national discussion. Big surprise. But I mean, right now we've got in Congress basically two major bills, right? We've got the MORE Act and then we've got Schumer's bill. And I think that for what they have in them, that's great. But ultimately, I don't know that any of them are going to pass, number one. And number two is they just don't contemplate the things that I think are most important. So we've got the MORE Act, and it's focused on promoting an industry, and that's a good thing. And it's also focused on racial justice, which is also unquestionably a good thing. But there's nothing about patient care, nothing at all. And this is going to be the largest group of people because it's everybody. And there's no regulatory framework, so the MORE Act is great sort of high-level discussion. One might, in a cynical moment, call it virtue signaling. But I didn't say that. Unfortunately, Chuck Schumer's Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act is fairly similar. It's got a lot more detail, but it's very business-friendly. The taxation level, as you guys have seen, was untenable. They've revised it. It's still untenable. There's just no way that that is going to work, superimposed on state taxation and with the idea that somehow we're providing these medications at a reasonable cost and also overruling the illicit market. And again, at least the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act mentions patient care, but it gets about a half a page or half a paragraph and basically says, yeah, the FDA will do something. But the key is that, yeah, the FDA would like to do something, but it doesn't come with any money, right? And we know that you can't do administrative process without hiring people to do it, right? So there's a little bit of, I think, disingenuity there. So in short, there's really no discussion of healthcare and no recognition that healthcare is a social justice issue too, and that we are overlooking the broadest swath of people who need this and who need support and protection. So, as the founder and leader of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, this is kind of our position. What does a federal medical system need to do? Well, the first thing is that we need exact prescriptions. We need to be able to write a prescription in one form or another, and it might look a little different from a standard prescription, but it needs to specify all of those things that I had said back a slide or two. And, you know, one of the things that's important about that is it makes sure that the healthcare provider steps up, right? We have this concept in the United States and generally globally of informed consent, right? Patients need to be told what is the medicine, what is it going to do for them, what are the risks, et cetera, and that and not just about medicine, about procedures also, and so that they can make an appropriately informed consent as to whether they're going to do this or not do that. And right now in the cannabis world, we're nowhere near informed consent, right? Here, go get some medicine, you know? So clinicians need to step up and to be able to have an important and detailed conversation with their patients about why they're getting this, what is this, what are those risks, what are the benefits, et cetera. And similarly, then when the patient gets to the point of sale, that site needs to be required to honor that prescription so that we get away from all of that conflict of interest stuff and upselling. And I think sometimes I hear from dispensary groups, well, that's going to, constrain us and not let us sell as much weed. And I said, well, you know what, that's true, but in the long run, this is good because it establishes credibility and reliability. And ultimately, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, which is far more tightly regulated than anything we see in the cannabis world, they're doing just fine financially, right? I mean, perhaps overly so, but that's a different discussion. Similarly, we need to get to the point where we're no longer having these sort of medical claims, right? We don't want people putting out there that their version of CBD cures COVID because that, number one, isn't proven, probably isn't true, but also it gets into the national conversation and undermines the validity of cannabis and cannabinoid medicines, and people don't think about it, right? We need state-to-state interoperability. I live in Massachusetts. Half of my older patients go to Florida for the winter, as they should, but yeah, because it's New England. But when they get down there, they're either in the position of having packed up a whole lot of gummies and illegally ferried them somehow down to Florida, or they're in Florida and they run out of medicine, and now what, right? So if they were on an opioid, if they were on a blood pressure medicine, I can write a prescription in Florida, and then they can get the refill and come on home and everything's fine. But we need that kind of thing for cannabis. Obviously, we need common safety standards. I said that safety was the lowest bar, but we can't get anywhere until we get to that bar. We have to define, and one of the things that's interesting is that every state has defined their testing program, et cetera, and they're all different, and none of them are 100% great. Some of them, like Massachusetts, are pretty stringent. Others of them, like Arizona, are much less stringent. It turns out, I learned this relatively recently, that in Maine, of all places, the medical products are untested, whereas the recreational products are tested. Yeah, right. But but the same thing was true in Colorado briefly. The same thing was true in Arizona briefly, and Maine just hasn't figured out that they need to plug that hole. And I have a friend who runs a dispensary up there, and she says, we test everything. It's one of our value adds, right? Okay, fine, but probably should be regulated. Clinical discretion doesn't seem to mean a whole lot, but what I'm really getting at there is these lists of conditions, right? Most of which, almost all of them include glaucoma, which is not a great indication for cannabis. We need to get rid of those. We need docs and other healthcare providers to be doing what they know how to do, what they're trained to do, and not just checking off boxes on a list. We need purchase feedback. You probably are aware of prescription drug monitoring systems that exist for conventional medications. In Massachusetts, we have something similar for cannabinoids. When the patients buy in the dispensary, I can actually see what they buy. The list isn't as granular as I'd like it to be. A lot of it just says oil, which is not very useful. But nonetheless, this allows me to have some idea of whether patients are sort of on track, and when I see them again in follow-up, I can say to them something like, I saw you bought, a non-edible manufactured product. What is that? Oh, you bought a salve. How's that working for you? Blah, blah, blah. So I think that that's really important. We have to acknowledge the ways in which the medical system and the recreational systems overlap so that we can make sure that people get into the right system that supports their needs best. And also, quite frankly, it wouldn't help us all that much to prohibit upselling, et cetera, on the medical side, only to allow it to go on the recreational side and sort of, just be the loophole. And then obviously, we need a research agenda. Right? One of the things that never fails to amaze me about the federal legislator is that, they'll come up with a great idea, they'll write a bill, and then, it passes, and then we just go ahead and do it. And oftentimes, for example, the crack cocaine sentencing stuff that came up in the 90s, we figure out later that this was a really bad idea. Why don't we pilot these things? Why don't we study them and then unleash them? Anyway, so we have scrolls worth, right? I mean, like if I were writing a scroll, it would be down the hall and out the door of good questions that we need answered in this research agenda. Like, can people really tell the difference between an indica and a sativa? Some of my patients say yes, most of them say no. Let's find that out. Randomized control trial. We'll go out in the hall. Thank you. So this is just a little bit of a plug for the ACS, the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. Our goals here are to increase the standard of care for patients, making sure they get what they need. Education for who I call referring physicians. These are the people, and I use the word physician, but I really mean clinician. And these are the people who are not going to practice cannabinoid medicine. These are our primary care and neurologists, dermatologists, you name it. They don't, I think, have the bandwidth to know this stuff, at least not now, and that's okay. Because you know what? They don't know the depth of cardiology or endocrinology either. They handle the stuff that's, relatively well common, and then there are specialists. So we need the docs and other clinicians out there to know, when is it appropriate to use cannabinoids? When is it not appropriate? What, that sort of thing, and then when to refer. And then, of course, for the people who are going to practice this medicine, we really need to make sure that they have a deep understanding. I was talking with somebody earlier today, and she was saying that, she knows more than her certifying physician. And granted, she's well-educated on this topic, but it shouldn't be that way, that nobody who's certifying or writing a prescription for this should be doing it without knowing what they're doing. That doesn't seem like rocket science, I don't think. So that's the education for specialists. We want to work with dispensary groups and product manufacturers so that we can help them understand what's at stake and help them achieve products that are then beneficial to our patients. Obviously, we want to encourage the research that we just talked about and improve the law and regulation around these sorts of things. So if you have the interest, CannabisSpecialist.org is the website, and I welcome you guys to visit that and consider joining. This is my last slide. I'm available for questions pretty much night or day. You can go to Cannabis Specialist. There's lots of resources there. You can also email me directly at president@CannabisSpecialist.org. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. Thank you so much for listening. And I have no idea how much time that took, so I don't know where I'm ahead, behind, whatever.
We have time and encourage questions. So,
good, please.
Steve, you're going to be on one side of the room, and I'll be on the other.
Oh, get the Donahue moment.
Yeah, and then we have questions in the chat room coming in from Zoom. So, Karen, Steve will get you in a sec.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to hear you, be with you, and what an honor.
Thank you.
So last week I also attended the Regulation Summit for Public Health and Cannabis Regulations. And in regard to regulation, no one seems to be bringing up the recent HR 8454, which is an expansion of marijuana and cannabinoids research policy that has passed the House. It is sitting with the Senate as of July, and in it, it includes expanding registrants to do research, FDA increased manufacturing, patient and doctor conversation, and so my question is, how are we supporting that? Because that's a huge baseline for all of the issues and sort of a stop point when we need research and we need studies, and then we don't have the availability or the potential to do these studies with Schedule I.
I think you have a great point. I think that, politics in general, but of this country in particular, are somewhat beyond my comprehension. So I think that what we've seen is that there are a number of more narrowly focused bills, even the Safe Banking Act, right, that we should pass. And we're not seeing a lot of motion on them at the moment, largely because there's this desire to sort of pass this, comprehensive magnum opus bill, the MORE Act and the cannabis, whatever it is, Schumer's bill. And I think that there's some legitimate argument that if you put together these omnibus bills, then you can gather in the support that you need across the aisle and from various sort of special interest groups, et cetera. And I think that's the motivation there, but it's not working. And so my sense is it would be better to take the incrementalist approach, get the Banking Act, passed so that I've been thrown off how many credit card processors just as a doctor because of this. And then we could start looking at that research agenda, so yes is the answer. And that particular bill isn't one that I know the details of, but it sounds like something that we should be pushing on. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi. Don't you think we're putting a cart before the horse a little bit?
In so many ways, but what is not on your mind?
In regards to provider inclusion, when very few of our medical schools teach anything about the endocannabinoid system. So if you're depending on this cadre to push forward, how did he do it in darkness?
I think you have yes. I think more so than the cart and the horse, it's more of a chicken and egg. But you're right. And again, I think that the solution is incremental and iterative, right? We're seeing the fine University of Maryland putting together a program, that isn't specifically directed at the doctors and nurse practitioners, but it's getting this knowledge out there. I'm in the middle of designing a CME course with Harvard University Medical School aimed, again, at the primary care level folk, to try and get that knowledge out there. We have to sort of deal with where we sit, right? So we've got fairly few knowledgeable clinicians at this point, and we need to build that up, and that's what the ACS is about. But you're right, we have to introduce this curriculum earlier so that people come out of the medical schools and other clinical schools knowing something about it. They don't have to know all the details. I mean, trust me, I've learned the Krebs cycle, 15 times, and I can still tell you, you come out with ATP, right? But the point is that if I saw something about the Krebs cycle, it wouldn't take me that long to kind of pull up the details from the data bank and be able to make a reasonably informed determination of whatever the question was. And I think that that's really what we need to be able to achieve with medical personnel to begin with. So you're right, we've got to get into the medical schools. But in order to get into the medical schools, we've got to find interest at that level, and that's tough to do with sort of, fairly conservative schools. So as we grow this industry and professions with those who have already graduated, we may be able to swing back into that medical school stuff.
Does Harvard have a curriculum in its medical school towards endocannabinoids?
Not at all. They tell me, and I don't know the degree to which this is accurate, that it is covered as, in the course of their basic physiology class.
Well, so would you clarify the difference then between what's not in the curriculum and then the CME that you said you're partnering with Harvard?
Oh, sure. Well, I think what's in the curriculum, and I can't really speak to this in detail because I've never seen it in action, but what I understand is that there's mention of the endocannabinoid system, there's mention of the various receptors, et cetera. And I believe that that's largely as far as it goes. I was told that there was also some mention in the psychiatry portion. I don't know anything about that, and just the mere fact that it's in the psych department makes me worry that it will be more about cannabis use disorder than necessarily about its potential benefits, although I would have to say that in my travels, my encounters with psychiatrists have generally been very positive about cannabis as a therapeutic. Not 100%. The subgroup of addiction specialists are a tougher group, but, and understandably so, right, because they only see the downside of that. What's in the course that I'm designing, which is not aimed at medical students, it's aimed at practicing physicians and nurse practitioners, is really the stuff to get their feet wet. This is the endocannabinoid system. These are the clinically relevant cannabinoids. This is what we know about them. This is what we don't know about them. This is the difference between inhalation as a route of delivery versus oral. This is why you might choose one versus the other. And then issues around pregnancy, around children, et cetera. And then sort of ultimately at the end talking out myths versus fact and politics. And I'm hopeful that that will be available maybe early spring, something like that. It's taking longer than I expected, but then everything does. Hope that answers your question.
Hi.
Ma'am.
My question is, how do you foresee writing exact prescriptions? Back in the day, you could write a prescription for Pentaviral 180, blah, 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 blah. You throw little antibiotics at it, and pretty much you killed it. But obviously with cannabis, it can be very strain-specific in writing a prescription. So do you suggest perhaps like something like they do in Israel?
I think that's a brilliant question. Many of the details need to be worked out still. And I think that what we really need is to design a system that is thoughtful enough that we can continue to use it as our knowledge grows. So that at the moment, one might write a prescription for a particular strain, or one might write a prescription for flower that had, say, 15 to 20% THC, which is sort of the way I tend to do things. But down the line, we are going to want to be able to write a prescription that says, 5 milligrams of THC, 1 milligram of CBD, 0.3 of a milligram of CBN, plus these terpenoids, right? And so we need a system that is going to allow us to do that, but we don't have the knowledge to do that at this point. So we've got to have a system that allows us to get more specific as our knowledge becomes more specific. And we're working on something like that. At this point, just getting the concept of a prescription into this industry, I think would be a major step forward, right? So.
Good morning. Thank you for presenting to us today and acknowledging the barriers to optimal success of a medical cannabis program. Could you speak a little bit on how your state has addressed these barriers, and especially as a state that has legalized adult use, what you recommend for states considering such legislation in terms of adult use? If there's a model state that you think that has really tackled this well, and what makes them the model state in terms of their medical cannabis program coexisting with an adult use program?
Ask me an easy question, why don't you? So number one, let me say I don't think any state has gotten it right. There are states that have gotten bits and pieces right. And so ultimately, any kind of national or international policy is going to have to be the greatest hits of, right? What worked aggregated. One of the things that Massachusetts did right was around the list of conditions. We have 8 conditions, but immediately following the list of conditions in the law, it says, or any and all other debilitating conditions as, provided by the clinician. So essentially the list of 8 conditions becomes suggestions or examples, but in terms of legally, we can use cannabis for what we see as appropriate medically. And so I think that's one of those bullet points on the slide that I was showing you. Another thing that Massachusetts did right, particularly where recreational came in, was that there was a fair concern that the recreational market would sort of gobble up the entire supply. And so they did make a rule that 30% of the supply at any, co-located recreational and medical dispensary, 30% would be reserved for medical patients only. And there's one particular dispensary group that I think has done a nice job because they have a number of products that really are of little interest recreationally, but are very useful medically, and those are only available to the medical patients. And they're the only dispensary group that I think, actually segregates particular products. But, and I think Massachusetts is not that different from other states in this regard, they have now, generated a commission, a cannabis control commission, who's not made up of people who have any particular focus on medical, and that the current statewide as well as nationwide discussion is on recreational and is focused on the social justice aspect, sort of to the exclusion of any of that health care. And I think that that's unfortunate. I think those discussions need to happen without question, but somehow they've occupied, they've sucked up all the oxygen in the room. So I think that, if you look at other states, for example, Florida has something they call an order, which is essentially a prescription. I don't think it has the detail that we would like. It can be overridden, but at least it's an attempt at something where the doctor is required to put something down on paper or in a computer that says, this is what I believe the patient needs. And so I think we need to kind of go further with that. I don't think any state has really addressed the issue of sort of medical claims or the way in which the bud tenders are sort of out on the limb or any of those sorts of things. As you guys know, California, which generally speaking I think is first in everything but not necessarily best at everything, has now signed some sort of a compact with some neighboring states for interstate commerce. How that's not going to get the DOJ on them, I don't know, because that's pretty clearly defined as far as I, as a non-lawyer, can see in the Constitution as belonging to the federal government. But anyway, there's some attempt at some of that regional travel and homologation of product. So I think that that's good. I'm not sure that implementation is going to fly, but I think, again, the idea that we're starting to think beyond state borders is a good thing. I think there might have been more parts of your question. Did I hit the high points there? Okay.
Emily has questions from the chat.
Sure. He raises into it. I know in the past that you had questionable thoughts about terpenes, and I was curious, the other person asked a question about strains. What's your thought on terpenes and how those play into the medical impact, the medicinal impact they can have with patients in managing different conditions?
That's a great question. Thank you. I want to say something broader for a moment. I think the other thing that people have come away from my, writings and social media with this thought that I'm negative on CBD. And I am not. I am waiting for the data, right? And I'm actually participating in a number of studies aiming at getting that data. People sometimes say, Doc, are you pro-cannabis? I'm like, I'm not pro-cannabis. I am pro-patient. So if cannabis works for patients, that's great, but it's not that I'm have some, feelings about the plant particularly. So to your question about the terpenoids, I think that there's varying degrees of data to back their use, and very little of it's in human beings. So we've got some good data on the use of myrcene, particularly individually as a sleep aid that comes out of Germany, where it's actually marketed as such. We have growing evidence that beta-caryophyllene may be very useful for pain management. But again, none of this is in human beings, right? So we need to get there, and as soon as we get there, I'm going to be like, great, assuming that the data are positive. I participated recently in a study, and I can't give you a whole lot of details, but it was a randomized controlled trial, believe it or not, lowish N, 100 and 120 patients, looking at the value of CBD for anxiety. And what was really interesting was that 71% got anxiety benefit from the placebo. And nobody more got any more benefit from the CBD arm. Okay, maybe that just wasn't a big enough study. Maybe it wasn't designed the way it could have been. We certainly need to do it more and better, but that's interesting data. And what I truly think on the topic of CBD specifically is that if you look at the Epidiolex-based data, you need to give a whole lot more than what people are really getting at this point. And at those higher doses, we see some increased risk of direct liver toxicity and drug interactions and stuff like that. But there are many medicines, and one that comes to mind is itraconazole, which is an antifungal medication that we use because when people get fungal infections, it's pretty serious business. But this is a medicine that is dangerous. And so when you use it, you test people's liver function, not just at the start, but on multiple time periods to make sure that we are not crossing from benefit into excessive risk. And I think that we may find that CBD at 800 to 1,500 milligrams a day is very effective, but we also may find that it comes with things that we need to monitor for, and we need to know that. And the other thing is, of course, there's nobody who can afford 800 to 1,500 milligrams of CBD at present, so we either have to dramatically reduce the cost of CBD or get the insurance industry involved, and that gets all into that political stuff again.
Glenn, you had another question?
My big issue as a primary provider is how to, bring my patients along, make this more patient-centered rather than me-centered, provider-centered. Because my big issue is we're talking about this like a drug. It's not a drug. It's a plant. It has different pharmacodynamics. It has different routes of application, administration, and the patient self-titrates in many instances. So we're looking at two different models. My thought was more towards involving the patient not only in their consumption, but even in their growing. They know what they respond to. So that's where, and I'm not seeing much as far as the federales looking at that as a medicine and as a cultural, because we're talking about social determinants of health. More of a comment than a question.
Yeah, it's really interesting. My perspective is a little different, but I think, it's great to have difference of perspective. My experience has been that some of my patients fall into a category of folks who are interested in cannabis as a medicine and maybe interested in growing, and sort of they're interested in delving into it just, more so than they would delve into their blood pressure medicines, right? And that's interesting to me. And I work with those particular patients and, to talk to them about how they can make their own edibles or grow their own plants. And I often, one of the things that didn't get in here is what are we doing to incentivize people who grow their own to get it tested, right? But what I also think is that in the group of patients who do come to see me, that group is a fairly small subset, and that the larger subset are people who want to take this like a medicine, meaning they say, I'm just interested in feeling better. I don't want to know how it works. I don't want to muck around with it. I want to go to the store. I want to get it. I want to be done. And then what really motivates me is that I think that the group of people who actually make it into my office is a tiny fraction of a much larger audience who they and their clinicians are never even thinking about cannabis, right? Maybe, there's an area in Boston called West Roxbury, which is predominantly elderly white Catholic folks, and they maybe went to parochial school and they were really taught this is the devil's lettuce. And now that they're 80, and they have crippling arthritis, the question is, do they or their docs even think that cannabis could be useful to them? And I think that patient model, if you will, really represents the vast majority of Americans and humans who could benefit from this, but it never even gets on the docket for discussion. And that, to me, is the problem. And so for me, making this more of a standardized medical approach, I think has value in demonstrating both to the clinician and to that patient that this is an option worthy of consideration, and it's not sort of kind of this hippie thing, for lack of a better word.
Really enjoyed the talk and really appreciate your work. And my question goes maybe in a different direction. And we all realize how incredibly complex the plant is and the industry, and we know that the cart is before the horse, and appreciate tackling such difficult questions. I get interested sometimes in the thought of post-market surveillance, right? And can we sit behind both the cart and the horse when things are so complex, and we've been through an Avali scare that few talk about, and is there a way to capture that? And I've yet to kind of see a consolidated effort, and I wonder how you do that in your practice. In Massachusetts, does that exist? And on a federal level, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So I was having this discussion earlier this week with a group that is trying to promote exactly that, a better post-market surveillance program specifically focused on the cannabis side of things. And I think that I got really kind of two things out of that conversation. One is that the federal program that does this for conventional medications is miserable. It's just, the sense is that somewhere between 1% and 5% of adverse reactions make it into this system, and that it's also a very decentralized system. So some of that data comes through poison control, some of it comes through the FDA reporting system, and all of these computer systems are ancient, so they don't talk to each other at all, and pulling this together into some kind of a cohesive, let alone actionable report is Herculean, to say the least. And then there's the question of, what do you do with that in the cannabis world where things are as loose as they are? Surely one could look at an application like strain print or something like that and add an adverse reaction module or something that could give us some better foundation. But I think that, really, to answer your question, it's the right question, and I don't think that it's made it onto anybody's agenda yet except this one particular group. And I hope that it does, because we're, as you say, this stuff is out on the market, so we need to be, and the funny thing is, between the D8s that are out and the specter of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, I've seen a lot of my emergency room colleagues get very down on cannabis, sort of broadly. I don't think that the incidence of cannabis hyperemesis is a little bit unknown, but I think it's pretty uncommon. It is true we're seeing more people wind up in the ED with over-intoxication, but I don't know that I think that the appropriate response to that is anger. It is that we need to have better education for the clinicians and also for purchasers, right? On the recreational side, I often point out, remember way back when the New York Times writer Maureen Dowd went out to Colorado and bought herself a candy bar, right? that, I don't know, it had hundreds of milligrams in it, and it did on the wrapper apparently say, serving size is 1 piece, take 1 piece, but she didn't read it. And she ate the bar and spent the night in the hotel hallucinating. And then interesting to me is that she came back to New York and wrote a piece about how dangerous cannabis is and how bad the industry is. And like, wait a minute, you're a writer for the New York Times. How is it that you didn't read the wrapper? But the point is this. Here's a woman who has every reason to have read the wrapper and she didn't. So what can we really expect of, Johnny or Jane Q. Public, right? So if it flummoxed her, we need to do better on trying to make sure that people know that, a little is good and a lot might not be so good, right? That's so figuring all that and figuring out how to appropriately measure the adverse events. Yeah, we got to do that. I wish I had a more concrete answer for you. All right. I just want to make sure she gets a turn too. But go ahead, Miss Ann.
Okay. Hi. I work for a foundation, and we support cancer research, and I work with a lot of cancer patients. And we fund research over at Hopkins. And I know that they give these little zebrafish brain tumors, this glioblastoma brain tumor.
Yeah,
and
or zebrafish.
So in a meeting, I'm really interested to know if there's an avenue where they won't give the fish any cannabis to try and treat the brain tumor, which I'm so curious to know if that would help. Is there a resource that you know of for a study that could be started to give them this zebrafish with a brain tumor to expose it to cannabis? Because it's still Schedule I, Hopkins won't touch it.
Interestingly enough, the data for treating the tumor itself with cannabinoids, let's just say it's in its infancy. But glioblastoma is one of the areas where we actually have more data than other tumors. It is quite possible to get a Schedule I license from the DEA so that you can do research on cannabinoids in an academic institution like Hopkins, and I'm certain that there are folks there who possess such licenses. Once getting such a license is a, shall we say, very non-trivial act, and then getting access to the cannabis is a non-trivial act. So that deters a lot of people. I feel
like it might be easier to take the fish out of the hospital.
It might be.
I've already looked at that avenue.
One of the things that's interesting is that many of the states have come up with these research licenses. And for example, in Massachusetts, they have a Massachusetts cannabis or cannabinoid research license that one can apply for. And I know that there are a few folks at UMass who've gotten them, but when I asked the commission how I could apply for one, I was told, well, we don't really know, so why don't you hire a lawyer and we can kind of negotiate this, which was all beyond my time and means, so that didn't happen. But the point being is there are states that have ways to do what you're talking about. Pennsylvania recently passed a bill that pairs some of their dispensary groups with academic institutions specifically to do this kind of research. And actually, I'm hopeful to be able to work with some of that. So I think that there are pathways forward, but they're all kind of working around, right? Now, NIDA just came out with a new agenda this week that looked at that talked a lot about looking at therapeutic benefit. So we'll see. Maybe there's some funding and encouragement there.
Thank you.
Sure.
It's a little broad spectrum, but we talk
full
about
spectrum.
Yeah, right.
Sorry.
Full spectrum.
Didn't go there.
That's right, full spectrum. We talk about placebo effect in medicine often, and it does have its own therapeutic value or for what it's worth. But in cannabis, we have a very unique effect that I think is called stigma effect. Like, I mean, I know it's new. We're not getting much research in a lot of cannabis right now, but your example of the seniors and geriatric community who have, for their entire life have learned this is the devil's medicine, and they're finding, therapeutic relief in it and recommending doctors, and then they take this medicine, and there's got to be something within us that says at some point, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this medicine, and I know it's helping me, but I'm anxious about it, or now I'm depressed about it. And we end up seeing these neuropsychological effects that are kind of contradicting these therapeutic effects. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I had a conversation with one of my patients, I think it was yesterday, it was a long day yesterday, in which it was a fascinating case. He's a 50, 60-year-old gentleman, so we're not talking about a kid, and he came to me using way too much cannabis, having all kinds of negative outcomes in his life. And he's one of the very few patients where I actually felt confident in putting cannabis dependence on his problem list. And we've been working together for about a year now, and he has dramatically reduced his cannabis use and is getting markedly better therapeutic outcome. I should also say that, he's a professor, so it means high-level interactions. And yet, to your point, he said, it's working great. I'm using less than I ever did. Everybody's happy with me now. And yet there's still this little voice in my head saying, you should feel guilty about this. This isn't okay. And I said to him, you know what? I think for people of a certain age, where we grew up with Nancy Reagan and frying pans and eggs and stuff like that, and it's true for me too. There's moments when I say, Jordan, what are you doing out stumping for cannabis medicine? You're supposed to be this blah, blah, blah doctor, whatever. But you know what? It works, and it works better, as his case exemplifies, if we use small doses in controlled fashion. And I said to him, look, I don't think we're ever going to get past that as individuals. What we have to do is acknowledge it and say, little voice, you're wrong, please, thank you, but sit down, because we can use our brains to say, this is not harmful, look at how well we're doing. But I really do think that, for a certain generation, that's always going to be an issue. And my hope is that subsequent generations, like my daughter, who's nearly 20, will just not have that. And, while she was growing up and I was doing this kind of medicine, she learned that cannabis was medicine. And I took her now, 10 years ago to see Weezer. And we're standing in the seats like this, and the smell of weed comes by, and she says, Dad, what's that funny smell? And I said, oh, that's cannabis. And without missing a beat, she says, well, why would anyone be using their medicine here? And I said, okay, I did something right. Sure.
We have time for one more question that's coming in from the chat.
So this one is a little bit more straightforward. Can you just talk about delivery methods and sort of how you counsel patients on that, and maybe what your most frequent delivery method is in terms of routes of administration?
Sure. To me, that is fairly straightforward, though I'm sure that others will disagree with me. I think it basically comes down to inhaled versus oral. And, we can talk about topicals, but frankly, there's a lot of evidence that cannabinoids don't get absorbed unless you start to do some interesting pharmaceutical stuff, which we can do, but are not presently. When it comes to the edible stuff, right, oral stuff, the value in it is that it is converted through the liver into a new drug. So it's what we call a prodrug, right? It's the same delta-9, but because of the metabolism, we get something different. And while it takes longer to work, to start working, it works longer once it starts working. And so we can think of oral as our long-acting form versus inhaled, which is really quite rapid in its onset, sort of 10 to 15 minutes, but it also wears off in 3 or 4 hours. So their use cases are different. So I typically say, look, in In illnesses that are acute or episodic, for example, a migraine headache, right, where we know from the non-cannabis literature that the best treatment is rapid. We need to get in there, knock it out before it gets out of control, then inhalation is the way to do that. And you notice that I say inhalation. I'm not recommending that people smoke. I also think that those little vape pens have been demonstrated time and time again to be dangerous. So I'm really talking about flower vaporization. But that is an appropriate use in that situation. Whereas somebody comes in and they sort of have 24/7 back pain from osteoarthritis or knee pain or those sorts of things, that we know from the literature around pain management that short-acting medications create that yo-yo effect, and our brains can actually learn when the stuff is going to wear off and the pain comes back worse than we had it before. So we don't want to use the short-acting stuff. The other thing is if you're using the short-acting stuff multiple times per day, the total exposure to the THC is very high, as opposed to, say, using the long-acting gummy, where 10 milligrams might, get you by for 8 to 12 hours. So that's kind of how I tend to think of it.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tishler.